So welcome everybody, and we have half an hour this evening with Doug Strakarczyk, the co-founder of the Mental Toughness Model and the Mental Toughness Profile Assessment Suite. And we're going to take this opportunity to give you a deep dive into the actual report summary that we have that will give us and have a look at what the actual numbers and the data behind the mental toughness profile might tell us around leader behaviours and the impact of that on themselves and the people in their teams and organisations. So, but before we start, let me just share the screen, and I will ask you to put your questions into the chat box, and we'll do our best to cover those as well. But if we don't, we'll certainly get back to you to get back to your questions after the session. I want to keep it short and sweet because hopefully it will be a valuable resource that we can share with others as well. So just a bit of background on Doug for those of you who haven't met him. And Doug, welcome. But just on myself, I am an executive coach in the science and technology industry here in Sydney, Australia. And I had the good fortune of actually meeting with Doug and Pete. It was actually a year ago, Doug, when I was in Manchester for your Mental Toughness User Conference. And that certainly has set me on the path to really dig deep into this methodology and the level of evidence behind it. It certainly gives me a lot of confidence when I'm working with leaders and their teams that we're working with something solid. So I'll let you introduce yourself and take it from there. Over to you, Doug.
Thank you, Leah. And it's always a treat working with you, Leah, because you're one of the very few people that shares a little bit of history with me. That's the biochemistry bit. You don't come across many biochemists who've switched over to this kind of activity. We're usually in test tubes and stuff like that, but I'm glad we made the switch. So I'm Doug Strakarczyk. I have been working for 30 years now with Professor Peter Clough. And to be fair, Peter Clough is the person who first worked out what mental toughness was. And he identified 4 critical components called the 4 constructs. Now, since that time, Peter and I have been able to take that concept to another level. We've been able to identify 8 factors, which I'll describe very, very briefly in terms of leadership in a moment. And my life has been completely dominated by this notion of mental toughness. A very simple definition is it describes our mental responses to events. There are 2 critical words here. One is our mental responses. So it's really describing how we think when things happen. Now, how we think, we know determines to a very significant extent our behavior, our performance, our well-being, and our emotional responses. So it's fundamentally important. It is an aspect of personality, and it's probably a more fundamentally important aspect of personality than the aspects that we normally deal with, which are behavioral. The other is it's our response to events. Now, we're beginning to use this phrase when things come back to normal. Well, normal includes times of crises, but the crises are usually events with which we've had some prior experience and we've got some way of being able to deal with it. And so normal includes good times, bad times, but they're usually manageable. Occasionally, and this is the current situation, we come across times where events are outside of the norm and they create extreme levels of pressure. So it's a situation that we tend not to be familiar with. I don't know what's happened, Lee. I think this slideshow is gone.
Yes, I'll just bring it back in a moment.
So what we're experiencing now are events that are out of the ordinary. So is this making an impact on our mental responses? And the answer is, it is. What I can do, Leah, I can share the screen from my end.
Is that going to be easier? Yeah, because I've just got the mental toughness model there, but that'd be easier for your flow. Thank you.
So what I'm showing is that we represent the 4 constructs, the 4 key elements of mental toughness, and the 8 factors that support them through a pizza image. And I'm just going to take just a couple of minutes to go around that image in terms of its impact on leadership. So if we start up in the top left-hand corner, we're talking about control. And control really is describing the extent to which an individual feels sufficiently in control of their life and circumstances to be able to achieve what they want. Now, not only is this a requirement in leadership, it's an expectation from followers. Followers tend to expect the people who are in leadership roles and who show leadership that they somehow have a better grip on things than the follower might. And it's one of the reasons why they might trust somebody in a leadership role. And there are 2 elements. One is life control. And this is where the sense of can-do sits. And this is truly where the sense of I have sufficient control over events for me to be able to be confident I can achieve what I want. Well, if you look at what's happening right now, and for the last 3 or 4 months, our sense of control has got to have been challenged in a significant way. So if you look at leadership in organizations, leadership in politics, leadership everywhere, a lot of the certainties and the things that you would have some sort of sense of self-worth around suddenly have become very, very fluid and very, well, even flaky. So what this is doing is challenging a lot of people's ability to believe they can manage enough of what's happening around them. The emotional control one is similar. This is about the extent to which I can manage my emotional responses to events. Now, most of the time, somebody with a reasonable degree of emotional control can manage their emotional responses. But very few of us are people who are absolutely perfect and can do it all the time. In the present circumstances, there are massive pressures on people in leadership roles, and their ability to manage their emotional responses, again, is being challenged. If we look at commitment, commitment has 2 elements. One is goal orientation, and goal orientation is about me being able to set goals for what I want to achieve. And sometimes I do that on behalf of others. That's the leadership effect. Right now, people are finding it very difficult to think in terms of goals more than the next couple of days. There is so much uncertainty around. We're not even sure what the world will look like in 6 months' time. What will be the norms? What will be the new reality? So in that context, it's really difficult to set goals. So if you're somebody that is reasonably goal orientated, this can again be very challenging. Similarly with achievement orientation. Achievement orientation is about, it's a link to goal orientation. It's about doing what it takes to achieve the goals. Well, if you can't see the goals clearly, it is incredibly difficult to focus all your effort and marshal all your effort towards achieving a goal. Now, those 2 elements, control and commitment, generally represent what we would call resilience. And that is our ability to survive in difficult times. So we can see that our ability to survive, never mind thrive, is being significantly challenged. However, the elements on the bottom half of the image talk about the elements that enable us to thrive. But again, there are huge challenges. So one of those is challenge. And challenge consists of 2 factors. One is risk orientation, and that's the extent to which I'm prepared to look at a new situation or a challenging situation and either, if you're mentally tough, see the opportunity. If I'm mentally sensitive, see the threat. So mentally tough people tend to be more solution orientated. Mentally sensitive people in this respect tend to be more problem orientated. Well, if we're really honest, at the moment, it's easier to see the problem than to see the solution. So again, this is very challenging for people who are mentally tough and who are leaders. Now, it's one thing to take risks, to stretch yourself, to push yourself for very good reasons. That's the way organizations grow. But we also have to learn from our experiences. And right at the moment, we are in probably the steepest learning curve I've known for the past 30 years. Our understanding of things, of the virus and its impact and the economic consequences is changing almost daily, but we're having to learn from all of our experiences. And again, for people in leadership roles who are naturally reflective, this is again a very challenging time. And then finally, there's confidence. And confidence has two elements. One is confidence and abilities. That's self-belief. Do I believe I have the abilities to be able to cope with what's happening? It's not too difficult to see that that's going to be very challenging for people who are in leadership roles and whose leadership position often depends on their confidence and abilities. And then that's allied to interpersonal confidence. And interpersonal confidence is describing that the sense that I can influence events, I can influence others as much as they influence me. That's not really the case at the moment. Events and others are influencing almost everybody more than they can influence them. So you can see that even people who are mentally tough suddenly finding themselves in a position where sometimes that mental toughness is really being tested. Now I'm going to very briefly go on and show you a real live example. This is an example of an individual who came to us now about 4 or 5 weeks ago. This is a highly successful senior executive in a major international organization who had a very successful track record, who had a fantastic team around him, and COVID-19 came along. Two things happened. One is because they were successful and such a strong team, the organization handed several of its key projects, all to do with dealing with COVID-19, to this individual and his team. But the team also did what almost all other teams have done. They dispersed. Basically, everybody went to work from home. So a team that had been in a normal office environment suddenly started to work remotely. Within a few days, within a couple of weeks, the leader of that team, this highly successful executive, began to show real signs of strain. And he had the nous to go and speak to a coach and ask for help. And that coach used the mental toughness questionnaire, which was enabled us to get an insight into what was happening in leaders at this time. If you look
Doug,
at the
maybe you can just explain what the mental toughness profile assessment is.
Right. Okay. So if I go back to the previous one, what we have is a valid, reliable, and independently validated mental toughness questionnaire. It's a psychometric measure. It is capable of providing an overview of an individual's overall mental toughness. It provides information on their position on control, commitment, challenge, and confidence. But more importantly, it provides information on their position on the 8 factors. And it's digging down to that level of detail that's critically important. Now, it's important for another reason. Now, not every psychometric measure is essential. This is quite important, an important psychometric measure, because what we're trying to do here is assess something that's happening inside somebody's head, not their behavior. Now, almost every psychometric measure that people use currently are behavioral measures, but we can see behavior, so we can often correlate what we see with what we assess and come to a pretty useful conclusion. It's really difficult to see inside somebody's head. You've got to be extremely skilled and take a long time to be able to understand that. However, with the mental toughness questionnaire, which we can get a good idea of where that individual's mental responses are coming from. And that enables us to be more accurate, and that is really important. And secondly, it enables us to get to some sort of answer much more quickly. Now, the output from the questionnaire comes on what we call a STEM graph. That's a normal way of reporting psychometric measures, and they're reported on a scale of 1 to 10. The midpoint, the norm, the average person on the planet would score 5.5. So we can see that this individual scores 7 on overall mental toughness. That would indicate that that individual is more mentally tough than most. And that's part of an explanation of how he's got to where he's got. When you look at some of the elements, and this is illustrating the importance of being able to dig deep, his life control score is extremely high. Goal orientation and achievement orientation, high. Risk orientation, right at the extreme level. Confidence and abilities and interpersonal confidence, all above average. Now, these are all very powerful qualities. You can see how this individual will have got to where he got to.
So,
However,
Doug, with the risk orientation, sorry to interrupt you. I'm just, I haven't often seen a 10. Is in risk orientation. So is that someone who is saying yes to absolutely every challenge? Are they, what sorts of behaviours are you likely to see with somebody with such a high risk profile? Or are they a loose cannon?
No. So a score of 10, as you probably know, Leah, is achieved by roughly 2.5% of the population. So these are the people who are right at the far end. This is the kind of polar explorer. This is the person who climbs Everest, but also the person who takes, like Zuckerberg, he starts an idea in the garage of his house, and next thing you know, he's a billionaire, because they see opportunities. They are very solution focused. They see opportunities where other people see threats. Now, at this level of score, this person will see opportunities maybe where there aren't really opportunities, but it's so positive about the world around them that they get fascinated by everything they see. The potential downsides of somebody with a high level of risk orientation, and this is bringing out I think the point you're looking to make, Leah, is that although we talk about mental toughness as a strength, mental toughness also is potentially a weakness, because if you are too high on something like risk orientation, you can take too many risks. You can be too fascinated by things that you shouldn't really be fascinated about. You can be easily distracted by something that really interests you and it's completely off the wall, but it actually isn't that important to you. So,
but I think when you look at the combination with the confidence in his abilities is 9. Yeah. And the life control is not. This person generally, as you said before, looks like someone who's absolutely certain about the way they make decisions and where they're going.
Yeah, absolutely. And people who've got who've got high levels of risk orientation tend to have their antennae up, so they tend to be better at scanning the world for opportunities. So, in big strategic roles, you will very often find people who are fairly risk orientated. Probably the biggest potential downside of somebody who's risk orientated is they will very often start projects and not finish them because they get fascinated by the next project. And the newness or the excitement or the challenge of a project is what attracts them. They're very valuable because they will find opportunity, but sometimes they're not the best operationally. But what we can see here is that in terms of 6 of the factors, this individual has got all the hallmarks of great leadership, and we know from this individual track record has achieved a lot in normal times. However, this individual also has an emotional score at 3. That puts them into the 16% of the population who are least able to manage their emotions. So when things go wrong, this person is most likely to show their anger, their disappointment and share it with others. You will see their emotions. You will see them if they're happy, and you'll see if they're angry. Similarly,
and I wonder with this, the positive learning orientation, like that would what would that sort of tend to, are they more likely to be impatient? They just want the bottom line. They just want the outcome.
Exactly. And yes, so he has very little learning orientation, so he's not that reflective. When things happen, whether they're good or bad, he just accepts them for what they are and doesn't think about, doesn't extract the learning, doesn't think about them. Now, what had happened to this individual is, first of all, he rejected this, but then through exploration, a good coach will do this, he began to understand that this was actually a fairly accurate picture of him, because what he understood was that the team had learnt to live with him. And so basically, they knew his level of emotional management very well. So if he did throw a wobbler, they just dealt with it. They made a joke out of it. They calmed him down. If he was excessively happy, again, they would calm him down. So the team was actually acting like a counselor or a mentor to their boss. They were absorbing his emotional responses. Now he's at home on his own. His team aren't around him. So who's doing it? Nobody's doing it. So he's just getting more and more emotional and less able to manage those emotional responses. But as you point out, Leah, he is also finding that they make mistakes. They don't get it right first time. Now, what we also learn is that the team was the place where the reflection was happening. So when things would go wrong, the team would work it out and they would present it to their boss, to this individual, who would accept it and say, oh, thank you, that's a great idea. We now know how to do this better. But he wasn't the source of this and he wasn't the initiator of it. But he's now sat at home, things are happening. He hasn't got that kind of connection with the people around him. And he's getting more and more frustrated when things happen. He can't understand why they happen that way. And then when they happen again, the mistakes are repeated. He's getting more and more frustrated. And it's not too difficult to see a combination of a low level of learning orientation and a low level of emotional control being a major problem. And he was heading towards significant mental health problems. Now, this is a successful leader, but you change the setting, you change the environment, you change the situation, and suddenly things that were not issues become issues. And this is
I think we see that often, don't we, when you've got like a leader that is hot under the collar, and often the team will put up with it and work around it. It's just the way that person is. We see that kind of overcompensating a lot in the corporate world. But like you say, he's not dealing with being alone without having that interaction.
Yeah, absolutely. And what we can see here is that mental toughness itself is not situational. The impact of your mental toughness is very situational. So to be self-aware, I mean, this is all leading to self-awareness. Mental toughness is a framework. The mental toughness questionnaire is a very powerful tool to help you understand either your client or yourself better, but it is self-awareness that's critically important.
And I think, as you mentioned too, it's the conversation with a skilled, trained coach, someone, like myself, who has been trained in working with this tool, because it's always only going to be of value to the client if they are able to see themselves in it and the impact of themselves in it. And I think data like this is a great way to see where are you actually going to then create a coaching sort of intervention program, right? But it's got to be, the client obviously has got to be on board with it. And so that's why I like working with the data, a really solid data-driven approach like this, because we can use this to inquire, to see, where, you know, where is this showing up for you, and where is it working and where isn't it working?
Yeah, and there are two other things that I would add. Firstly, it is bringing the ability to identify the individual's needs. You know, I'm not a psychologist. I work with a lot of very clever psychologists, and they all tell me, the theoreticians tell me, what is really important is understanding individual differences. And yet in the practical world, in the operational world, we tend to ignore that. We tend to put everybody through the same sort of programs and through the same sorts of solutions, because this worked with Joe, let's see if it works with Nellie. Understanding the individual is critically important. If you can do that, you can direct your interventions better, and you can get much, much better results from people.
Absolutely. Now we've just gone 6 o'clock, Doug, but I'd really, I think if we can go, if you've got another, I don't know, another 10 minutes,
no problem.
I think this, you've hit the nail on the head with the individual assessment process, and this is what we're seeing in all sorts of studies that are coming out on the effectiveness of leadership development programs, and leadership development coaching is the most effective methodology. It is the individual, the personalized approach with this. But it's now the next level of work that's coming out that, you know, I'd love you to talk about briefly, that gives another layer of allowing us to then develop even more personalised interventions.
Right. Are you referring to the work of Costas Papageorgiou?
Yes, yes.
Right. So that's quite a challenge to explain that in a couple of minutes. We've been working with Queen's University in Belfast, which is one of the leading universities in the world. Dr. Costas Papageorgiou has established a mental toughness research centre there. And one of the things he's done, it's fundamentally quite important, is he has looked at, firstly, what is the connection between mental toughness, which this is describing the mental aspects of our personality, and the Big Five personality model, which is probably the most reliable, most highly regarded behavioral model of personality. He also looked at the sources of stress, and he looked at the dark triad, and the dark triad is psychopathy, Machiavellianism, and narcissism. And the reason why I looked at that is these are three ideas that very often crop up in leadership work. It's often suggested that leaders are Machiavellian, psychopathetic, and narcissistic. So he used a technique called matrix analysis, where he got lots of people to complete, I think it's about 800 people to complete the mental toughness questionnaire, the Big Five measure, a stress measure, and a dark triad measure. And then the program was established to identify the connections between the core elements of each of these models. And that's what you can see on screen. It produces a network of connections. The red circles or red nodes are the 4 elements of mental toughness. The purple, hopefully this comes through as purple, are the 5 elements of the Big Five model. The stress measure is in blue, and the dark triad is in green. Now you'll see that there'll be connections and different thicknesses of lines. If it's a very thick line, it indicates there's a very strong connection between this mental process and this behavior. If it's a very thin line, it suggests that it isn't a particularly strong relationship. And if it's a red line, it's an inverse relationship. So here what this is saying is, if you've got a high level of control, you're less likely to be neurotic. Here we can see if you've got a high level of commitment, mentally, you're likely to be a conscientious individual. Both of those make sense.
And but also when you look at it as far as leadership competencies, conscientiousness has been, you know, researched and found to be the most valuable competency, if you like, or trait in good cultures, in positive organizational cultures. So you can see, obviously, the commitment you would expect to be very strong between conscientiousness and commitment.
Yeah, absolutely. In our own work, you know, it's often forgotten that we actually do a lot of work around leadership, and we on behalf of the Institute of Leadership and Management, we did an interesting piece of work. We identified the 3 core elements of leadership. I mean, we talked about pure leadership, leadership itself. And the number 1 element was something that we describe as determination to deliver, which picks up this notion of conscientiousness. The most important thing that followers value in leadership is that the person demonstrating leadership knows where they're going and is consistently behaving in a way to get there. And we think that's partly because a lot of people don't actually have an immediate purpose for themselves, and they buy this purpose from an effective leader. So conscientiousness and commitment are critically important in leadership. There are 2 things, and I guess I can almost only have enough time to say what this is also saying. What this is showing is that one of the aspects of the dark triad, narcissism, may not be as negative a quality as we often assume. Because what we can see is a very strong connection between confidence, extroversion, and narcissism. And what Costas is pointing out is that narcissism itself is simply, I think I'm great. And so if we stuck another word, label on that and said, oh no, let's call that confidence and not narcissism, we'd buy that. However, some narcissists demonstrate a negative quality. They not only believe they're great, but they actually look down on other people and will treat other people badly. There are not a lot of those narcissists. We are actually all have a bit of narcissism in us. Not all narcissists behave in this bad way. The interesting thing about Costas's research is he's shown that mentally tough narcissists are much less likely to show these negative qualities than a mentally sensitive narcissist, which is illustrating the importance of mental toughness in leadership. But the other thing that's emerging is this is the average network for 800 people. What Post has then found us, this is not the matrix for every single one of those 800 people. The matrix was actually different for each individual, again, illustrating the point of individual differences. So sometimes these connections would be slimmer, much stronger. They might even change direction in each individual. And what he's beginning to explore and beginning to find some evidence for is this is explaining why when we introduce an intervention, some interventions work for some, but don't work for others. And it's down to the network or combination of connections. And not only that, sometimes when you introduce an intervention, you might get an unintended consequence. And we know that both of these things happen all the time. But we don't know what's going to happen until after we've done it. Here he's suggesting the research might take us to a point where we will be able to predict which interventions are going to work best for this individual. But just to illustrate that very briefly, if we were looking at this and this was the actual network for a particular individual, if we were targeting to boost confidence, if those connections with extroversion and narcissism are reasonably strong, we might inadvertently boost their extroversion, but we also might boost their narcissism, and that might not be what we intended. So that's a very, very quick run through. This is kind of what's happening next. But
yeah, and that's what excites me, Doug, that this is just in its beginning stages, but you know, the potential for this to help us choose the interventions that are going to be more likely to work given a network of traits. It's no longer just labels, and a lot of the other psychometric tests just label you this or that or the other, but the mental toughness model doesn't label us as such. And now you overlay that with other models and methodologies, and we start to see we're unraveling the complexity of each of our uniqueness, and that's what excites me, because you know, as we see, you know, there is just no end to the combinations of traits and the dominance, and the great thing is that it's all able to be developed. It's all developable. None of it is cast in stone. Whereas, you know, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, the personality, you know, methodology was that you're born with certain ways of being, and that's it. So I think where this is going, and it really excites me that you and the team at AQR International are leading this work. And I'm very, you know, I'm very excited to be part of that with you.
No, thank you, Leah. And you're absolutely right. I mean, one of our clients, a very big hospital group, spoke about their training budget, and their training budget was literally in hundreds of millions of pounds. It's a global organization. And the first thing they said to me is, we have this budget and we know that we waste at least 30% of it, but we don't know why. And part of the solution is in here, not the whole of the solution, but part of the solution lies in understanding the mental toughness of the people they're working with.
And having a really broad and deep evidence-based approach to why we're doing what we're doing. So I think this really boosts the argument for investing in evidence-based methodologies and approaches.
So you're absolutely right, Leah. I mean, the whole basis of our operation, we wouldn't be doing this if we didn't believe that this was evidence-based. There are now over 100 research papers which either support the concept or support its application. There isn't another psychometric measure anywhere that is as well evidenced as this. So I don't know whether anybody's got any questions that's worth.
Let's see, maybe we can stop the share now. Is that something you do? Share screen. Oh, this will stop. Okay, so if we stop the screen share, just briefly before we, does anyone have any questions? It's been a very quick and deep dive quickly, but that's how we work. And I guess this is where, you know, our clients are time poor as well. So I certainly appreciate having something so visual and that is so comprehensive about the workings, the inner workings of our minds, and again under stress, because leadership is a stressful role. It just by its nature.
Yeah.
So, and I think certainly, you know, with the research that we have already and the data and the support, this is definitely a very effective tool that adds a lot of value to our, it gives us a measurable set of metrics to work with that supports the coaching process really, really effectively. So let's, I'll stop the recording now. And I thank you, Doug, for your time and your energy tonight, or the morning for you.
Yeah.
And yep. And so I'll just stop the recording now.
Yes, thank you, Leah. And of course, none of the listeners will know that we had our own mini crisis immediately beforehand. So we hope that didn't show.